In a quiet little town where the sun lit the cobblestone streets with warmth and golden hues, flowers bloomed joyfully in every garden. The scent of fresh blooms mingled with the soft rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, creating a peaceful and lovely atmosphere. In this picturesque town lived a boy named Oliver. He was just 10 years old, but he had a world of imagination bursting inside of him. His messy brown hair often hung over his forehead, and his bright green eyes sparkled with curiosity, like two emeralds glistening under the sun. Every afternoon, after finishing his chores and homework, Oliver would venture out into the sprawling fields that surrounded his home. The fields were filled with tall grasses swaying in the wind, wildflowers dotting the landscape in shades of blue, yellow, and red. For Oliver, these golden hours were magical, and he frequently imagined himself as a brave knight on a noble quest for adventure, wielding a mighty sword and fighting dragons or rescuing princesses. He would run through the fields, standing tall against imaginary foes, with the wind at his back, feeling as if he could conquer the world. However, one sunny afternoon, something unsettling began to break the tranquility of his happy retreats into nature. As Oliver wandered a bit further than usual, feeling the thrill of adventure run through his veins, he decided to explore the woods that bordered the town. He loved the woods. They were filled with towering trees that whispered secrets to one another and hidden paths that felt like doorways to another world. But that day, as he roamed through the trees, something strange caught his eye. Just at the very edge of his vision, he noticed an odd shadow that seemed to slink between the trunks of the trees. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The shadow didn't look like a squirrel darting around or even like a deer grazing nearby. Instead, it appeared more like a dark smudge over the vibrant greens and browns of the woods. At first, Oliver thought it must be a trick of the light, maybe the way the sun was shining down through the leaves, or perhaps it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Yet, a feeling of unease began to tug at his heart. What was it? His pulse quickened, and he felt a chill run down his spine. This was not the first time he had encountered something strange. After all, sometimes the woods could be full of surprises, especially when you were a curious boy like Oliver. As the days passed, the shadow began to appear again, lurking just out of sight. Each time he turned to look, it seemed to melt away into thin air, disappearing before he could catch a proper glimpse of it. Soon, terror began to bloom in his heart. He could feel it each time he caught a glimpse, an icy tendril creeping along his spine. The woods, which once felt like a magical kingdom, slowly morphed into a sinister realm where every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs echoed in a haunting manner. The trees, once friendly companions to his adventures, seemed to shudder and sigh, whispering forgotten stories of the past that sent shivers through him. On one particularly tense afternoon, fueled by a mix of fear and curiosity, Oliver decided he needed to confront whatever was stalking him. He had to prove to himself that there was nothing to be afraid of. With each cautious step deeper into the woods, he felt a growing dread settle into his stomach. The thick branches overhead twisted and turned, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The air grew thick with an uneasy silence that pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. Suddenly, a gust of wind rustled the leaves, and he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. Was it real, or just a figment of his imagination conjured by his growing fear? With his heart pounding loudly in his ears, he squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to summon his courage. It was time to open his eyes and face the shadow. When he finally opened them, to his alarm, the shadow was clearer, more defined. It was an ominous shape hunched low among the trees, with edges that seemed jagged and rough, like the shards of broken glass catching the fading light. The slow movement of the shadow sent a jolt of panic through him. It emanated a chilling aura, causing the hair on the back of Oliver's neck to stand straight up. Fear flooded his veins, propelling him to dart away from the chilling sight, stumbling over roots and branches in his frantic escape. The haunting presence followed him, lingering in the corners of his mind as he pushed through the underbrush, desperate to find the safety of home. When he finally burst through the trees and into the familiar light of his neighborhood, a wave of relief washed over him. He was safe, but the grip of fear still held tight around his heart. Back at home, as he attempted to shake off the incident, he told himself it was merely a trick of the shadows, maybe even his imagination running wild. But deep down, he knew it had felt too real. Days turned into weeks, but the shadow grew bolder with each passing day, creeping closer and closer to him. Oliver could feel its presence more than ever now, like a cold breeze tickling the back of his neck, and he could hear the steady thudding of his own heart echoing in his ears, drowning out the usual sounds of the woods. Nights soon became unbearable, as the sinister presence invaded his dreams, turning every peaceful moment into a nightmare. He would wake up in a panic, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around him, his pillow soaked with fear. Oliver wanted to tell someone about what was happening, to find comfort in sharing his burden. But he confided in no one. Who would understand? His parents were often busy, caught up in their own lives, like all the adults in the town. They had work and chores, and they often seemed to forget about his imaginative adventures. His friends would only laugh at what they thought were wild tales from a boy with too much imagination, and Oliver couldn't bear to see them laugh at him. So, he chose to lock his fear away deep inside, allowing it to consume him like the shadow itself began to do. With each passing day, the bright colors of his cheerful life slowly faded into grim and bleak hues. He stopped playing in the fields, wandering the woods, or imagining grand adventures. Instead, his days grew dark and filled with uncertainty. The vibrant laughter of children playing in the streets became muffled to his ears, as if the world had decided to move on without him. It was hard to concentrate on school, even harder to smile when the oppressive shadow loomed larger in his mind. Oliver's heart felt heavy, burdened by the looming dread that seemed to swirl around him endlessly. He often found himself staring out of his bedroom window at the darkening woods, wondering if he would ever see the light again. Would he ever reclaim the joy of those carefree afternoons spent with imaginary dragons and heroic quests? Or had the shadow truly taken over his life, marking the beginning of a dark transformation that felt as if it would last forever? As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over his room, Oliver vowed that he must find a way to face the shadow head-on, to peel back the layers of fear that wrapped around him tightly. If there was something to fear, he would uncover it, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to banish the cold touch of that darkness before it consumed him entirely. The time had come for a new adventure, albeit one filled with uncertainty and dread, but perhaps if he approached it with bravery, he could reclaim his sense of wonder and joy once more. Determined, Oliver began planning to venture back into the woods. He would not run from the shadows anymore. He would fight them with courage, knowing that every great adventure required bravery, just as he had imagined in the countless stories he had read. He was ready to discover what lay in wait at the edge of the woods and to shed light on the mysteries that filled his heart with fear. And with that brave thought in his mind, he took a deep breath, hoping for clarity, ready to confront the shadows lurking at the edge of his new adventure. As the days stretched into weeks, the shadow became an inseparable part of Oliver's life. Each morning, he woke up feeling its weight looming over him, like a great storm cloud ready to burst. The air in his small room felt thick and heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. Sunlight would spill through his window, but it never seemed to make the dark feelings inside him go away. Every time he thought about going back to the woods, he felt a tight knot forming in his stomach. Those trees, which once looked so inviting and friendly, now seemed like looming giants, watching him with unblinking eyes. Leaves rustled in the wind, and he imagined them whispering secrets about him. He began to avoid the woods altogether, fearing the terror that awaited him there. Instead, he sought refuge in his small room, surrounded by his colorful toys and stacks of books filled with adventures waiting to be read. Yet, when he opened those books, he found it hard to focus. The creeping sense of dread lingered, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. No matter how much he buried himself in tales of dragons and daring heroes, the shadow seeped into his very thoughts. Every flicker of movement in his room sent him into a frenzy, heart racing as if he had just raced against time. The creaking of the floorboards, the fluttering of curtains, even the scurrying of a mouse outside, all of it felt like the shadow was trying to break in and claim him. One evening, Oliver overheard his parents speaking in hushed tones. The soft sound of their voices floated up to him like a whispering breeze. "Oliver is not himself lately," his mother remarked, concern lining her voice like the edges of a worried frown. "He seems distant and withdrawn." Her words echoed in his mind, amplifying his feelings of isolation rather than comfort. They couldn't know the terror that wrapped around him. It was his burden, and he felt utterly alone in his battle against the relentless darkness. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Oliver felt a spark of determination flickering within him. He couldn't live like this, constantly looking over his shoulder, afraid of shadows that danced in the corners of his vision. He decided to face his fear, determined to understand the terrible entity that haunted him. Maybe if he knew more about it, he could take back control of his life. He devised a plan to venture into the woods at night, when the darkness was thickest and the shadow would be at its most potent. The thought of walking into the woods when everyone was asleep sent shivers down his spine, but deep inside, a small voice urged him to be brave. Armed with a flashlight that flickered like a candle in the wind and a heart full of trepidation, he set out into the moonlit woods, his body trembling as he stepped beyond the familiar threshold of safety. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels beneath a star-speckled sky. Their gnarled branches twisted in unnatural shapes, and the shadows they cast felt alive, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for him. Every rustle of leaves and snap of branches made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The cool night air wrapped around him like a heavy cloak, amplifying all the sounds that filled the woods. There was something unnervingly alive about it, as if the very ground underneath him was pregnant with malevolent secrets that had been kept for centuries. With each timid step deeper into the woods, he felt the shadows claw at him, desperate to pull him into their embrace. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, fighting back the wave of panic rising in his throat. But curiosity tugged at him, pushing him forward. Then he saw it, a shapeless figure standing still beneath the boughs of a gnarled tree. The shadow loomed larger than life, stretching impossibly tall, distorted in the pale light of the moon. Oliver's breath caught in his throat, a primal instinct urging him to flee. But instead of running, he forced himself to stand still, curiosity battling with fear in his chest. It was then he noticed the eyes, glowing like embers in the night, piercing him with an intensity that felt almost alive. They seemed to look right through him, and in that moment, Oliver felt a strange mix of fear and fascination twist within him. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice cracking in the stillness, barely breaking the silence of the woods. There was no reply, just the rustling of leaves, as if the very woods were laughing at his desperation. The shadow took a step forward, a grotesque movement that seemed to defy the laws of nature, making Oliver's heart race faster. He felt an icy grip on his heart, pounding mercilessly as the space between them closed. It was as if every step the shadow took came with the weight of Oliver's deepest nightmares. In that moment, he realized that the shadow was not merely a figure, it was something much more sinister. It was a harbinger of madness, feeding off his fear, drawing nearer with every tremor of his heart. Frozen with dread, he felt its breath, cold and rotten, like a forgotten dream turned sour. The air vibrated with a strange energy, making the hair on his arms stand up. It was a voice, not spoken aloud but whispering deep within his mind, devouring his sense of reality. Oliver understood then that this was no ordinary creature. This was the embodiment of his darkest fears, a shadow formed from everything that made him feel weak and small. Just as he felt the ground shift beneath him, he turned to run, but the path had vanished. It was as if the woods themselves were playing a cruel trick on him. The trees twisted around him, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, ensnaring him in their malevolent grasp. With every step, his strength weakened. The shadow was relentless, growing bigger, more monstrous with each thud of Oliver's heart. It consumed all light, cloaking him in a darkness so profound that panic surged in him, a violent tide that threatened to pull him under. He stumbled through the woods, the familiar paths now impossibly tangled, like a huge knot. His heart thundered in his chest, and desperation clawed at him as he pushed through the thick underbrush. The shadows around him seemed more alive than ever before, whispering his name in a chorus of eerie laughter. In those fleeting moments, he felt more alone than he ever had, as if the very essence of companionship had faded away. The trees stood as silent witnesses to his plight, towering above him like solemn guards, their bark twisted with age and secrets, watching as the shadow came closer, determined to claim him as its own. In a frantic bid for safety, Oliver's flashlight flickered and dimmed, struggling against the darkness that pressed in all around him. The beam of light bounced off the trees, illuminating the twisted roots and tangled vines that wrapped around his ankles like a net. "I have to find a way out," he thought, fighting back against the fear that threatened to swallow him. Gritting his teeth, he pressed ahead, calling on every ounce of bravery he could muster. "Don't look back," he told himself. "Just keep moving forward." But the whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around him, wrapping him in a cold, clammy embrace. Each step felt heavier than the last, almost as if the very ground was trying to hold him back, to keep him from escaping whatever nightmare this was. Suddenly, he spotted a small clearing up ahead, bathed in silvery moonlight. It felt like a beacon of hope, and without thinking, he sprinted toward it, heart racing and breath coming in quick gasps. The shadows reached out, clawing at him as he bolted for freedom. The moment he burst into the clearing, he felt a rush of air, as if the darkness had suddenly pulled back just a little bit. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, covered in moss and surrounded by wildflowers that glowed softly in the pale light of the moon. A place of magic, maybe? He thought, trying to calm his racing heart. The well was ancient, perhaps holding secrets of its own, and for a moment, Oliver felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. But the shadow didn't stop. It loomed at the edge of the clearing, no longer just a dark shape but a swirling mass of despair. The glowing eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking, and Oliver could feel the tension gripping at his throat. What did it want from him? What would happen if it got closer? Swallowing hard, he approached the well, a spark of defiance igniting in his heart. "I won't let you take me," he shouted, his voice firm despite the tremor of fear that still coursed through him. The shadow stilled for a moment, as if considering his words. Oliver seized the moment, a thought blooming in his mind. What if the well could help him? He peered down into its depths, the dark water rippling like a dark, mysterious sea. "Will you save me?" he whispered, more to himself than to the shadow. Clutching the flashlight tightly, he took a deep breath and let the light beam down into the water. To his amazement, the light danced across the surface, illuminating strange ripples that seemed to respond to his presence. The shadow crept closer, curious yet cautious, but Oliver stood firm. "You don't belong here," he called out, pulling strength from deep within himself. A surge of bravery filled him as he stared into the eyes of the shadow, determined to stand his ground. Then the water in the well began to swirl more violently, reflecting not just his own image but the very fears that had haunted him. He could see flickers of memories, shadows of his past fears all swirling and intertwining, each one a reminder of moments when he felt weak or frightened. But as the images continued to spin in the well, something incredible happened. With each pulse of the light, he felt the weight of those shadows lessen. He understood that they were just that, shadows. They held no true power over him unless he allowed them to. The revelation crashed over him like a wave, and he took a step closer to the well. "You're just a part of me," he said with newfound confidence. "You can't scare me anymore." The shadow paused, its form flickering uncertainly. The glowing eyes seemed to dim, and Oliver saw an opportunity. Maybe the well could help him transform that shadow, to shift it from something terrifying into something he could control. "I choose to be brave," he shouted, feeling the power of his own courage weave through him. With that cry, he raised his flashlight higher, directing the light fiercely at the shadow, pushing against it like a warrior facing a foe in battle. The swirling mass retreated, writhing as if it were being pulled backwards, the weight of darkness no longer able to hold him back. In that very moment, Oliver felt something shift within him. The shadow was still there, but it was no longer an enormous monster ready to consume him. It shrank and twisted, the glowing eyes dimming until they were just reflections of the fears he had faced in his own life. Tears filled his eyes not from fear, but from relief and triumph. "Thank you for showing me," he whispered as he felt the last remnants of dread dissipate, like mist melting under the sun. The shadow, now small and less threatening, flickered one last time before retreating into the night, no longer able to haunt him. Oliver stood in the clearing, heart racing and pulse pounding, but this time not from fear. This was the pulse of victory, of triumph over the darkness that had seemed so powerful only moments before. As he turned back toward the well, he felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The moon shone brighter, stars twinkling cheerfully in the sky, and the air felt fresh and invigorating. With newfound strength, he made his way back home, knowing that he could face whatever came next. The woods were still there, their mysteries untouched, but Oliver was different now. With each step he took, he felt a sense of empowerment surging through him. The darkness no longer defined him. He would embrace the light, and while shadows would always be a part of life, he now understood that even shadows could be faced, understood, and transformed. The woods might still hold their secrets, But Oliver was ready for whatever adventures awaited him in the days to come, confident that he had the courage to shine bright, even in the darkest of places. The days blurred into a haunting montage of shadows and despair. Oliver was no longer just scared, he was thoroughly consumed by dread. It was as though the world had turned into a gray painting, with no bright colors or joyful sounds. The shadows around him stretched longer and darker each day, and they felt like they were reaching towards him, trying to pull him down into a place he didn't want to go. The shadow did not relent, it followed him like an ominous cloud, unyielding in its persistence. Every glance at a corner or quick check behind him revealed nothing more than the dimness, but the sensation remained. Someone, or something, was watching him, waiting. It was like a game of hide and seek where he was always the one hiding, and the shadow was never supposed to find him, yet it always did. The rest of the world, with its laughter and brightness, felt far away, as if he were looking at it through a thick, murky glass. Nothing could reach him in those moments, no friends, no joyous moments, just a loneliness that wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. At school, his friends noticed his deterioration. They weren't mean, but their laughs cut through him like arrows. It hurt to hear them tease him, laughing about his nervous tics, the way his fingers would twitch or how he would jump at the smallest sounds. They were just joking around, but to Oliver, it felt like a storm crashing down on him on a sunny day. Rather than anger, Oliver felt a deep sadness. How could he explain the weight of the malevolence that lurked just outside the bounds of his sight? How could he make them see that he wasn't just being silly, that he felt truly threatened? He became a ghost drifting through his day-to-day life, a shell of the cheerful boy he once was. In the lunchroom, when laughter filled the air, he sat quietly, pushing his food around the plate as if it were moving in its own little world. His favorite sandwich barely tasted like anything at all, and the bright red juice in his box seemed less vibrant each day. He often looked out of the big windows, where the yellow sunlight danced on the playground, piercing through the shadows that had taken residence in his heart. It was beautiful and sad all at once. One fateful afternoon, with the sun dipping lower in the sky and the day turning darker, Oliver made a decision. Sitting in his room, surrounded by toys that lost their shine, he was tired of running, of hiding in his room, avoiding the shadow that relentlessly haunted him. Instead, he would confront it once more, but this time, he would not go alone. He knew he needed a friend, someone brave enough to face the fear with him. Clara was the only one who might understand, or at least, he hoped she would. He confided his fears to Clara the next day at school during a moment when they were alone in the library, surrounded by towering shelves filled with stories of adventure and bravery. Her eyes widened as he spoke. She listened closely, considering what he said, a furrow forming on her brow. "You really think there's something out there?" she asked skeptically, but there was a softness in her tone that made Oliver feel less alone. "Yes," he replied, his heart pounding. "It's always there, creeping. I can feel it watching me. I'm scared, Clara. I think we have to go into the woods together." Clara took a deep breath, looking conflicted. "Into the woods? You mean where the old willow tree is?" she asked, her voice trailing off in uncertainty. The woods were dark and tangled, famous for their mysterious shadows and eerie sounds, just like Oliver's fears. But after a moment, Clara nodded. "Okay, I'll go with you. But I'm a little scared, too," she confessed, squeezing his hand a bit. That afternoon, they gathered their courage and a few flashlights, spirits dampened but resolved, and headed towards the darkened embrace of the trees. As they approached, the air shifted, turning cool and thick around them. Oliver's heart thumped loudly in his chest. Would they find the shadow lurking there, waiting for them? As they trekked into the heart of the ominous forest, shadows danced around them like mischievous spirits, the branches swaying gently overhead. Each sound made their hearts pound like drums. The rustle of leaves, the creak of old branches, and the occasional sigh of the wind. The forests, once familiar to Oliver during joyful summer days, now felt twisted and foreboding, each rustle and groan amplifying the tension and fear like a heavy drumbeat in the silence. Clara clung to Oliver's arm, her face a mixture of curiosity and fear as they ventured deeper. They reached a clearing, a wide space surrounded by towering trees that loomed like guardians keeping watch. Izzy, the neighbor's dog, had once chased butterflies here during sunny afternoons, and laughter had echoed among the blooms. But now, in this flickering twilight, the ground felt uneven, and the trees seemed to bow low as if paying homage to something sinister. The air grew heavy, exchanging vibrations with a terrible energy, as if the very ground beneath them was charged with some ancient power. Oliver steadied himself, feeling his stomach twist into a knot as if preparing for a roller coaster ride. It was time to call out the shadow, to confront it head-on. He inhaled deeply, his heart racing like a wild animal, and called out, "Show yourself." The world fell silent, the woods seemingly holding its breath. Even the wind paused, and in that moment, Oliver felt the chill of its presence seep into his very being, wrapping around his soul like a vice, pulling him downward. Moments later, the shadow emerged, unfurling from the darkness like a nightmare taking shape. Clara gasped, stepping back, her gripped hold on Oliver tight. He could feel the tremor in her body mirror his own fear. Her eyes widened like saucers as she took in the sight before them. The shadow didn't look like a normal shadow. It was a swirling mass of darkness, with tendrils that reached out like hands grasping for something to hold. Oliver, however, held his ground, his resolve faltering yet still persistent. The eyes of the shadow glowed like molten fire, piercing into their very essence as it spoke to them, not in sounds, but in whispers that echoed through their minds, painting visions of despair and torment. Oliver felt as though he were being pulled into a dark pit, where all his worst fears and insecurities swirled around him like smoke, leaving him gasping for air. The shadow twisted and morphing into painfully vivid memories. Faces of people laughing at him, moments of failure, instances of loneliness clawing at him like 1,000 sharp claws. Clara, overwhelmed by the sheer darkness of the experience, began to shriek, fear spilling from her like a broken bottle, shards scattered everywhere. Oliver felt the weight of his own fear magnified tenfold. "Clara," he shouted, desperation rising in his voice. "We need to be brave together." But the shadow relished in the fear swirling around them, growing larger, more formidable and grotesque. It was as if the shadow fed on their terror, growing stronger with each pulse of dread that coursed through them. The ground beneath them trembled, roots twisting and writhing like snakes, ensnaring their feet. Desperation clawed at Oliver's chest as he turned to Clara, his heart filled with helplessness, but it was too late. The shadow lunged forward, engulfing her in a dreadful silence. Her screams dissolved into the air like a puff of smoke, leaving Oliver alone in the throes of despair. Panic surged through Oliver's veins. "Clara," he cried, straining against the dark tendrils that wrapped around him. But the more he struggled, the more they tightened their grip, pulling him toward the swirling darkness. It was too powerful, it was consuming everything that was good inside him. Yet amidst this overwhelming fear, a visceral understanding washed over him. The shadow was no longer a mere presence, it was now an all-consuming entity, relishing in the destruction it wrought. It was not just feeding on Clara's screams, it was feeding on his grief and despair, too. Oliver turned to escape, but found himself ensnared by the tendrils of darkness that snaked through the clearing, relentless in their pursuit. As he struggled, he caught sight of Clara's form again, her eyes wide with terror, a reflection of the fear he felt deep within. The darkness threatened to smother their hope, but even now, deep within, something flickered. An ember of courage flared briefly, and with each beat of his heart, Oliver fought against it. He thought of the laughter they had shared during happy times, their adventures, the way Clara could always see the magic in the world around them. In that horrific moment, Oliver made a choice. Though he felt the cold tendrils wrap tightly around his heart and mind, he would not let fear win. He would fight back. He would remind the shadow that its power only came from their fear. An all-encompassing despair swept over him, but in the darkest heart of that fear, he clung to the memories of light, even if it felt fragile and small. "Clara," he shouted again, this time not in panic, but in a rallying cry. "We are not afraid, we will not let it take our joy." With every ounce of determination, he summoned all those moments of happiness, the warmth of the sun, the sound of their laughter, and the comfort of friendship, calling out to Clara, reaching for her across the shadowy void. He focused on her, on fighting together, reminding himself he was not alone. As he did, something began to shift in the darkness around them. The shadow's form started to tremble, as if unsure at being challenged. Oliver felt a spark light within him, burning away the weight of despair. It felt powerful and exhilarating. "We can do this, together," he yelled, and with that, he reached out toward Clara, Their hands, though separated by shadows, seemed to resonate with the force of their shared memories. The warmth of friendship began to break through the cold of fear. The shadow screamed with fury, the darkness beginning to splinter as the light of their friendship surged forward. They were battling not just for themselves, but for all the moments they cherished together. Oliver could feel Clara's presence beside him, growing stronger. Together, they began to push back against the darkness, each scream of the shadow diminishing as their joy and courage grew larger. With one final shout of determination, they reached for each other, and in that moment, the shadows around them shattered into glimmering fragments like shattered glass, scattering into the wind. The clearing filled with the sound of sunlight breaking through, bright and warm, chasing away the horrors that had wrapped around them. As the shadows retreated, Oliver and Clara found themselves standing in the heart of the forest, surrounded by the beauty they had once feared. Sunlight poured through the branches, lighting the clearing once more as the haunting darkness fell away. Gasping for breath, Oliver turned to Clara. Their eyes met, and he saw the relief and joy mirrored in her gaze. They had faced the darkness together, and it had not prevailed. "Did we do it?" Clara breathed, her voice shaking with excitement and disbelief. "I think we did." Oliver smiled, a true smile that lit up his face. They felt different now, changed and stronger than before. The weight of fear had shifted, the power of friendship had triumphed. As they walked back toward the edge of the woods, hand in hand, Oliver knew that while the shadows might linger, they would never fight them alone again. There was still light in their world, and together, they could face anything that came their way. Days turned into weeks, but time had lost meaning for Oliver. The world outside felt distant and strange, as if it belonged to someone else. The vibrant memories of laughter and light had grown dimmer with each passing moment. Oliver used to be a lively boy, always ready for adventure, his laughter ringing through the playground like sweet music. But now, he felt like a ghost, floating through the gloom of his own existence. The shadow had become his reality, and no light remained to guide him home. The boy who had once climbed trees and raced friends down the street had vanished. In his place, there was only a hollow husk, lost in the grip of encroaching darkness. Most of the townspeople went about their daily lives, blissfully unaware of the boy's plight. They talked to each other, laughed at jokes, and waved as they passed by. But Oliver had become an obscured figure, blending into the shadows of the streets he used to roam. His once bright eyes were now dulled by despair, seemingly looking through everything and everyone. Friends would call out to him, their cheerful voices ringing like bells, but Oliver's heart felt heavy, and their words faded into the background, dulling into whispers. To them, he was simply an outcast, a boy who no longer fit in. But to Oliver, every friendly smile felt like a punch to his gut, reminding him of the joy that felt just out of reach, like a dream he could hardly remember. When night fell, Oliver found himself drawn back to the woods, those dark, thick trees that loomed like watchful giants. He didn't come to confront the shadow that had stolen his happiness. No, instead, he came to stand at the edge of his despair, allowing the cold embrace of the darkness to drape over him like a heavy shroud. The shadows felt familiar to him now, almost comforting. He craved the darkness that gently wrapped around his shoulders, welcoming him as a long-lost friend. No longer was he merely a spectator, he had become a participant in an unholy dance with the shadows. He felt their presence swirl around him, intertwining with his very essence, becoming one with every grotesque form that enveloped him. In the chilling grip of night, the shadows began to whisper. Their voices floated through the air, soft and hushed, swirling around him like conspirators sharing dark secrets. They murmured knowledge he had never sought but suddenly felt desperate to understand. The shadows fed off his suffering, amplifying his feelings of loneliness until they burrowed deep within him. They twisted his very thoughts into dark tendrils that strangled his sense of reality. The more he succumbed to them, the more frightening figures morphed into familiar companions. In their company, he found a strange comfort, a connection to something that was once alive inside him. Oliver's heart began to shift, and with each passing night, he felt a final act of rebellion brewing within him. He made a decision to abandon hope entirely. He stopped searching for an escape, for a light that had long since faded from his life. The shadows had transformed into a brotherhood of darkness, offering a bitter comfort that he clung to amidst the chaos. Each night, As he stood among the twisted branches and thick undergrowth, their bond deepened, wrapping him tightly in their embrace. The shadows whispered promises of eternal existence, tantalizing and chilling, in the forsaken silence of the woods. Time drifted on like thick, heavy fog, and soon murmurs began to emerge in the town about a boy who had vanished. People gathered in small clusters, sharing worried glances and hushed words. Locals remarked on his absence, their conversations floating away like fallen leaves in the autumn breeze, mingling with the rustling of the trees. They spoke of memories associated with a boy who once brought brightness into their lives, their voices tinged with concern, yet life continued in its own way. But in the woods, the shadow no longer stood at the edges, lurking ominously. Instead, it had gnawed at Oliver's very being, claiming him as its own, pulling him deeper into its darkness. As the days melted into weeks, the hushed echoes of the woods grew ever more undisturbed. Oliver had succumbed to the darkness entirely. It was not just an external shadow now, it was a grotesque fusion of his fear and despair that dwelled within him, forever shifting and changing, like dark waters in a storm. The joyful laughter of children that once rang through the streets was now a distant memory, replaced entirely by a cloying silence that enveloped his heart like a heavy blanket. He could still remember what it felt like to laugh, to run, and to be carefree, but those feelings were now buried beneath layers of darkness, too heavy to carry to the surface. In this forsaken place where echoes of laughter no longer resided, a sinister presence thrived in quietude. The woods became a place of warning, a story whispered among the town's children. They sometimes wandered near but never dared to venture inside. "Did you see the shadow flickering in the trees?" they'd say, eyes wide with fear and curiosity. They spun stories woven with caution, their imaginations full of dread about a boy who had been lost to the dark. Tales of strange sounds and ghostly figures filled their days, stories that made them shiver with both horror and intrigue. Little did they know that the boy they once knew, the brave-hearted knight with dreams, had given himself over completely to the suffocating darkness. To Oliver, the world outside felt like a dream long forgotten. The joys he had once known faded as he wandered deeper into the shadows. Each passing night grew heavier, and Oliver found solace in the whispering shadows, allowing them to guide him further into an unfathomable abyss. The more he listened, the less he felt the desire to escape. Hope became like a fragile glass toy in his mind, beautiful yet easily shattered. He wrapped himself in the darkness, choosing to dance with the shadows rather than fight against them. Every night was a new embrace, a new chapter in a story that felt unending. As night deepened and the moon hung high in the sky, the town settled into an uneasy slumber. The shadows moved like smoke beneath the canopy of trees, whispering secrets only they could understand. The children would talk in hushed tones around flames, their imaginations running wild, but Oliver was no longer a part of their narratives. They painted him in colors of lost hope, though he had painted himself in shades of darkness. He wandered further into the woods, welcoming the chill of the air and the rustling leaves that murmured around him as though trying to tell him something he could not understand. Some nights, he would find himself standing before the ancient tree at the heart of the woods, a massive trunk that twisted into the sky like a jagged finger pointing towards the stars. He pressed his palm against the rough bark, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him. "Is this where I belong?" he would wonder aloud. The shadows coiled tightly around him, whispering back in soft tones, comforting him, drawing him in. "Yes, this is where you are most free," they seemed to say. Days turned into a cycle of night following day, and Oliver's transformation continued. He became entwined with the shadows, learning their rhythm, their dance. He began to explore the hidden corners of the woods, the secret paths that twisted and turned like a serpent, leading to places untouched by sunlight. He found himself climbing under branches and over roots, pushing deeper into the mysterious gloom that welcomed him without judgment. Once, in the heart of the darkest night, he found a small clearing where moonlight spilled like silver upon the ground. He stood in the center, looking up at the stars that twinkled above, feeling a strange mix of sadness and peace. Maybe the stars are the eyes of those I've lost, he thought. Each star flickered back at him, but he couldn't tell if they mourned with him or simply observed his sorrows. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, as if singing a lullaby just for him. In time, Oliver began to understand the whispers. They spoke of ancient things, forgotten stories buried in the roots of the trees. They told him about the sadness many had carried before him, souls who had given in to despair much like his own. They were woven into the fabric of the night, trapped yet comforting, forever watching the world they were no longer part of. And amidst the whispers, he could almost feel the presence of those who came before him, souls lost and found in the shadows. Yet, despite this strange sense of belonging, Oliver's heart still held a flicker of something that pushed against the encroaching darkness. There were nights when he would wake, restless, dreaming of laughter and light. In those moments, he would hear faint echoes of joy drift through the trees like soft music. He thought he could almost see glimpses of familiar faces in the shadows, laughing and playing as they once did. But those memories felt like fading smoke, too difficult to grasp. And so, he remained part of the dark dance. As weeks turned into months, he became a legend whispered among the townspeople, an echo of the boy who once brightened their lives. "Be careful near the woods," they would warn the children. "You might meet the shadow of Oliver." The children would shiver at the thought, but they couldn't know that this shadow was no longer a figure of fear, it was a companion in silence. In the heart of the woods, beneath the old twisted tree, a truth took hold inside Oliver. He was both the lost boy and the dance of shadows, he was both light and dark. At times, he would still feel the sun on his skin when the breeze rustled through the leaves, a reminder of what waited just beyond the woods. But he had chosen the shadows, and in them, he found a home that accepted him fully, a darkness that understood his pain. And so, he stood there in the moonlight, swaying to the sound of the whispers, waiting for the night to embrace him once more. A boy forever entwined with the phantom of despair, forever lost to the shadows, dancing in the dark, with no way of knowing when, or if, he would ever return.